Professor Keith Lilley.
Yep, thank you. Thanks. All right, well, thank you very much. Thanks to Karen for asking me to come, to Rebecca and to Martha for hosting us in this amazing place, which I've not been to before. I mean, I live in Bangor, so on the other side, but it's great to be here. And I'm amazed by all of the instruments that you see around us. Thanks to John again for bringing those. It's great to see those. And I hope you've had a chance to see the exhibition as well that Karen has put together next door. So my name is Keith Lilley. I'm an historical geographer. That's historical, not hysterical, historical geographer. So my background is as a human geographer. I'm interested in maps and landscapes. So I'm really pleased to be able to be here. And I hope something of what I'm about to say will be of interest in terms of the topic that we're looking at today. So I've called my little talk Surveying the Surveyors, Archaeologies of Cartography. And what I'm interested in here is taking us on a little journey. It's a journey away from maps, really, but into the field, because for the Ordnance Survey, 200 years now since the beginnings of the Ordnance Survey on the island of Ireland, so we're celebrating or commemorating, if you prefer, the bicentenary of the beginnings of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. There's a tendency to focus quite a lot on the end product, which is a 6-inch Ordnance Survey map. I'm interested not just in the maps, but actually what goes on in the landscape, in the field, the survey work, where a lot of these instruments that we see around us in this room here would have been used by the Ordnance Survey personnel, by these sorts of chaps here. And this is an image which is actually often used in publications about the Irish Ordnance Survey or the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. And it's quite a provocative image, I think you'll agree. It's actually the origins of it, as you can see from the bottom of the image there, if you can read it. It's an image is captioned "The Royal Sappers and Miners, 1837. So it's about the right time for the Ordnance Survey surveying in Ireland in the 1820s, the 1830s to create the 6-inch Ordnance Survey maps, which we're perhaps so familiar with today. But the image itself, as it says there, was produced for the Jubilee book, which the Ordnance Survey gave to Queen Victoria at the Golden Jubilee, I presume it was, 1887. So sometime after the image itself of 50 years after 1837. The reason it's provocative, I think, is the way the men are uniformed and the way they are bearing arms. And in fact, Thomas Colby, who was really the lead, the director of the Ordnance Survey, not just in Ireland, but in Britain as well, was very well aware of the potential for the British military trained surveyors, the Ordnance Survey surveyors, the Royal Engineers as they became, to actually be in some ways enmeshed and embroiled in civil strife on the island of Ireland. And he made it very clear that if the men were to be deployed for the survey work, they were not to be involved in any kind of quelling of civil disturbances. This is the kind of language that's being used at the time. Now, the reason I'm showing it here, partly to raise this issue of the cultural politics of survey and mapping, and we've just seen some really good examples of that from over time, but because of what's going on in the background in this image. And that's what really interests me here, not so much what's going on in the foreground, the chaps in their finery, but if you look towards the back of the image, the distance there, you'll begin to see that there are some interesting things going on. For example, there are the tents, the camp, where the surveyors were based as part of the survey work in Ireland. It was necessary, of course, for them to be provisioned, but also to be accommodated. And they used mobile temporary encampments for that purpose. But you'll also see, it's great to have this kit around us here. You know, the two chaps standing on the hill to the left there, a little bit out of scale, you might say, in the drawing course. But to show the detail there, the theodolite that the one of the surveyors is looking through the telescope, and we've got some examples, of course, here of those instruments set up on its tripod, and taking a reading, looking across that loch to the other hill on the other side above the encampment is a beacon or a trigonometrical station, the point at which in the landscape this tower has been erected to provide a fixed point. And it's through this use of these fixed points and the surveying of them using the scientific instruments like the theodolite that it was possible for the Ordnance Survey surveyors to create a very accurate map of Ireland to the scale of 6 inches to 1 mile. So Ireland was the first country globally in the world to be mapped entirely at the scale of 6 inches to 1 mile. So it really was quite an incredible scientific achievement of the day. So I'm interested in what's going on in the landscape is the point here, in the field. What are these chaps doing? And what traces, what legacies are there in the landscape, which we can still discover today? And one of the projects I want to talk about is called Mapping Monuments, which was funded by National Lottery Heritage Fund. It was focused around Loch Foyle through the Benevolent and Coastal Lowlands Landscape Partnership Scheme. There's lots of these little booklets around. We have an exhibition at the moment in Armagh County Museum, if you're interested, but do take one of these. So the project Mapping Monuments was to look at some of the landscape legacies of the Ordnance Survey around Loch Foyle. And another project I want to say a little bit about is a project which is tied into the bicentenary of the Ordnance Survey and makes available digitally for the first time, freely accessible anywhere in the world, an archive of the early Ordnance Survey materials, including maps, letters, the Ordnance Survey letters, Ordnance Survey name books, and the Ordnance Survey memoirs. I see someone who's got some printed copies of the memoirs, but to make these publicly available online. So I'm going to say something about those projects, but keeping my focus on what's going on in the landscape, in the field. Why did the Ordnance Survey actually originally even come to be in Ireland? You know, it was obviously really initially in the late 18th century, late 18th, early 19th century, working in Great Britain. Well, it was down to the necessity to map accurately, survey accurately the areas of townlands, Ireland's ancient townlands, which were fundamental to the collection of a particular tax, the county cess. So that's really why the Ordnance Survey was here, doing that very detailed townland mapping work. And that's why the 6-inch scale was chosen as opposed to, say, a 1-inch map. A smaller scale map like a 1-inch map is necessary to have a larger scale map. These are available, this is the Prony historical map viewer, but GeoHive for Ordnance Survey Ireland, or Touch Éireann as it is now, have these available, and so does our OS200 website as well. But these are the 6-inch Ordnance Survey maps which are, I think, so fascinating to us. The place names, which are obviously usually pretty controversial. The features, the topographical features, what the landscape looked like 200 years ago. It's like a window onto the past. The controversy around the Ordnance Survey is something which attracts a lot of attention, rightly so, and particular through the work of Brian Friel Translations, which has a particular place in this part of the world, of course. So I like to just throw that quotation there out there from Friel. The captain is the man who actually makes the new map. George's task is to see that the place names on this map are correct. And I think although some have contested, obviously, what Friel was trying to do is quite an artistic enterprise, I think it begins to open up the map to us, to make us think about the processes, those encounters between the surveyors and the surveyed. We've just heard about Bartlett being decapitated. You know, surveyors, the word itself comes from surveillance, you know, watching over, to be observed. So there's always going to be that tension between those who are doing the surveying and those who are being surveyed. And I think that quote, so this is something we're interested in. And that kind of interplay, encounter, if you like, takes place in the landscape, in localities, in the field. I'm a geographer. I'd like to talk about being in the field. So I want to take us into the field through these next few slides, looking at these two projects to do that. Drawing on the one hand from, the more kind of historical literature like John Andrews' paper Landscape, but recognising the cultural politics at work here, which Brian Friel reminds us of in translations. There is quite an interest academically in the history of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. My focus is less on the history of the Ordnance Survey and more on the archaeology of the Ordnance Survey, to look at the landscape of the Ordnance Survey. And this is an issue that I think has been somewhat overlooked, actually. This is a quotation by a historian of maps, Matthew Edney. And in bold there, he's talking about these map historians, people interested in looking at maps, but generally not looking at fieldwork or surveying. So I think we need to address that gap. We need to sort of think a little bit about that. So I need to watch my time, I know. So do give me what time do I finish? Give me a shout, otherwise there's a chance you'll still be here at 6 o'clock. So there are these two projects I want to say a little bit about. And they're complementary. So the first is called Mapping Monuments. And this is a project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. It was really convened by the Causeway Coast and Glens Heritage Trust. I was one of the organisers or directors of the project, along with Grace McAllister and Andrew Bratton. They were from the Causeway Coast and Glens Heritage Trust, me from Queen's. And what we're trying to do here is to recognise the importance of the legacies of the Ordnance Survey in and around Lough around Benevena, particularly in relation to a really important piece of infrastructure which the Ordnance Survey created as part of its survey work in the 1820s, and that's the Lough baseline. So the project itself was to look at the landscape legacies of the Ordnance Survey, to look at the field archaeology of the Ordnance Survey, if you like, but also to begin to kind of maybe raise the profile a little bit more of the importance of those legacies as well. So I'm pleased to say Barry is here from the project and Peter's here from the project. We've got various people from the project, so thank you very much for coming. It was a community heritage project, very much community and volunteer driven, and we have pictures there of some of the volunteers. I mentioned Lough baseline. It was part of a fairly complex web of these different triangles you see on this map here. These different triangles represent a really important part of the map making process for the Ordnance Survey, of trigonometrical survey, of creating these triangles. You may have heard of triangulation. If you go out walking in the hills, you might see these little concrete pillars, which the Ordnance Survey created in the 1950s, 1960s. They're the sort of modern day kind of equivalents of what was being done in the 1820s, 1830s by the Ordnance Survey. I was interested, climbing up to hilltops, climbing to those summits to get a view across the landscape, just like we saw in that opening image, setting up theodolites and taking in the landscape. And that's what these lines on this map represent, is the lines where those observations were being made along some quite big distances. These are indirect measurements being created from the use of the theodolites. And if you look at the names on the map, Troston, Divis, Saul, Slieve Snacht, not too far away, of course, Slieve League, and then tying in those triangles in Ireland, tying into triangles in England, Scotland and Wales as well. And these triangles are the framework within which the Ordnance Survey created their 6-inch Ordnance Survey maps for Ireland. So they're a very important part of the process, trigonometrical survey. And right in the centre there, you might be able to see it, is Lough base, the Lough baseline. And this was a very important part of that process of creating this accurate survey using the theodolite of indirect measurements, across the landscape and across the sea, as opposed to a direct measurement on the ground using chains. We've got some examples over there where you literally would drag a chain through the landscape to make a measurement for survey purposes. And part of the trigonometrical survey involved this Lough base, which is a ground-based measurement, which you'll see in a moment when we come on to it, which was a way of checking, it was called a base of verification, checking the accuracy of those indirect measurements based upon the trigonometrical survey. The little quotation at the top left there just reminds us of Thomas Colby and the importance that Colby was in charge of the Ordnance Survey in Great Britain and also in Ireland subsequently. He'd already been working down the west coast of Scotland and was already surveying across the North Channel to the north coast. So he was already pretty familiar actually with this part of the world. The instrument they were using was not one of those sort of smaller theodolites. It was this thing, the 3-foot theodolite, weighing 300 pounds in weight. So it's quite a cumbersome, delicate instrument which had to be literally manhandled through the landscape. It's a very physical process, and you'll get that tomorrow when you go walking. Surveying is a very physical, arduous process. Now, if we go to Loch Foyle, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, the legacies in the landscape of the Loch Foyle baseline are these towers. They're called the base towers. There's 3 in existence actually now. This is the North Base Tower up near Magilligan. So I'm standing in a field here looking across to the Inishowen Peninsula. So Loch Foyle is in between the tower and the hills in the distance. There's Thomas Colby. He was the man in charge, if you like. He was obviously supported by a whole team of surveyors, one of whom is Drummond, Lieutenant Drummond, and the little quotation there is by Joseph Portlock, who was one of the men involved with Colby surveying Ireland and wrote this memoir. He says, Colby traversed Ireland from north to south in 1824, selecting the most suitable mountains for principal stations, that's for the big theodolite to be set up on, and collecting data for determining the probable limits of altitude, which seems very appropriate for this setting, to be represented on the map. So height is elevation is a really important part of the map making process from the field survey work, but so too is obviously distance. So you've got to think about vertical and also horizontal measurements in the landscape, and that's what these surveyors were doing. Colby himself had already scoped out this part of Ireland, particularly through having already worked down the west coast of Scotland, and was already fairly familiar with the advantages of Loch Foyle. For the baseline had to be some part of the landscape where it was relatively flat, to lay out these bars. And you can see what the men are looking at here. They're called Colby's bars. They were fixed measurements or units of measure, and they were laid out across the landscape about 8 miles in distance, from Ballykelly up to about Magilligan, to give you some idea along Loch Foyle there. And those tents, you see the tents there that they're using, protected Colby's bars. And these bars were being used to very accurately measure that distance of 7.89 miles or whatever it is. So this is the Loch Foyle baseline. This is where the project Mapping Monuments we were focused on. And look in the background there, we have another one of these tents. Another sign of the activities of the surveyors doing their survey work, yes, but also the wider kind of importance of the accommodation of the men themselves. So this is our team. These are our volunteers, our happy volunteers from the Mapping Monuments project. We were working especially around Bellarina Estate, around the River Row. And one of the things we were interested in is to try and locate the site of an encampment, which gets recorded, as you can see here, in a letter written by Drummond, who you've already seen the name Drummond, from 24th of June 1827. So obviously this is well within the time of the Loch Foyle baseline measurement. And Drummond is writing, and he says the encampment where the men are camped is by the side of Mr. Gage's Park Wall near the River Row. And we know where Mr. Gage's Park was. That's the Bellarina Estate, as it's called now. We know where the River Row is. So where was the encampment? And that was one of the challenges what we were trying to resolve, really, to learn a little bit more about where the men were living, but also to, for the first time, see if we can use archaeological methods to locate one of these encampments. So this is, these are fairly ephemeral things. They're tents. All right, so they're not big structural things. So what do we do? Well, the volunteers use metal detectors, which were licensed. I have to say that. Archaeologically, they were licensed. We were licensed to use those metal detectors. We weren't digging things out the ground. We were simply planting flags where we got an anomaly, they're called. So where your metal detector goes beep, it indicates metal's in the ground. We didn't dig that metal out. Plant a little flag. And the principle here is to try and find a concentration of activity. And that's what those red dots represent. You can see where there's lots of red dots clustering together. And then the park wall is, I don't know if this is going to work. Oh, no. The park wall is this. Okay. There's the River Road, there's the park wall, and the Ballerina house is over there. All right, so that's what the little red dots, we're trying to identify where the encampment might have been. And you can see a concentration in the woods, but also in the field. So these were all sorts of the methods that we thought would be interesting and useful to us to try and work out where the survey camp. 5 minutes, okay, thanks. And that Lockfoyle baseline is part of this wider landscape of survey. So the Lockfoyle baseline was this base of verification, but it linked into those summit stations, including the summit station on Slieve Snaght. And this is another really important part of the archaeology of the Ordnance Survey, which has been relatively neglected. So those of you who've been to the summit of Slieve Snaght, you'll probably be familiar with some of the things we're looking at on that aerial image there. These are stone structures which were associated with the survey work under Colby. I've ringed them there on the map. And there's even in the letters from Drummond to Colby references, the tent is now up, and in a few minutes the wall round it will be completed. So these are Colby's camps, as they're called in Scotland, constructed not like the lowland camp, which was fairly ephemeral. These are actually quite substantial structures, and they're still standing, but they yet need to be surveyed and studied. This is what they look like in Scotland. This is one of Colby's camps in Craigben, in the Western Isles of Scotland there. So these are fairly well known in Scotland, but they're less well known in Ireland. So there's a job to be done there of surveying these things. And that's what mapping monuments we were interested in doing. Right, so very quickly then, the other project I mentioned is a kind of very different project. For a start, it covers the whole of Ireland, whereas the Mapping Monuments project was really quite focused around Lough The Mapping Monuments was a landscape archaeology project fundamentally, whereas the OS200 project is what's called a digital humanities project. So it's using digital technologies to analyse records, written records or maps as well, to say something new about the Ordnance Survey. So partly that involves digitising content. So the Ordnance Survey maps themselves, if you look at the 6-inch Ordnance Survey map at the bottom, around the margins, there's information about the surveyors. So we can begin to use that information to excavate the maps. I'm talking here about more of a metaphorical use of the term archaeology, to look at the map as a source in itself and having a biography, and in this case, telling us who surveyed, for this particular map sheet, who surveyed it on the grounds. Captain Waters and Henderson and Lieutenants Hoare, Alexander and Chater, Royal Engineers. So the maps themselves contain a lot of information about what was going on in the field, in the landscape. And we can use the digital technologies, which we've got all this information in a computer, to begin to map it out. So we can begin to see, this is for County Waterford, my colleague Kat Porter did this work. She was the co-investigator on the project. And she's mapped out for the different sheets there who was involved. And if we begin to put that information together, we can begin to see actually the huge amount of work that was involved on the ground by the surveyors themselves. The map on the left-hand side simply shows the progress of the survey from 1829 in the north, in purple, all the way down to County Cork, County Kerry, 1842 in the south. But the graphic on the right-hand side is a new image. And if you look, it's got names: Yule, Wynne, Wright, Wilkinson, Whittingham. So those different colours in that graph represent the percentage number of townlands surveyed each year by a surveyor. And you can see it really ramps up. By the 1830s, there's a huge amount of industry, huge amount of field work being done by these men, but some more than others. So some of those bands of colours are thicker than others. So we get some sense of some differentiation in the activities of the surveyors themselves through this analysis. So this is just analysing the information around the edge of the map, in the map margins. Looking at, remember the Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps were about townlands, and the density of townlands varies across the island, as I'm sure you're well aware. So there are parts of the Ordnance Survey's work which involve very intensive measurements and survey of townlands, particularly in the centre around County Cavan there, as you see in those yellows. So we can do some interesting things with this information once we get it in a computer. This is another graphic, another output really. It's a bit complicated to begin with, but basically you're looking at, this is 1829, and this is 1830. So you've got time on one axis, and then you've got these names here of the surveyors, the personnel involved in the survey work. And you begin to see that some of these chaps didn't do very much at all. Okay, so it's very flat. Like, for example, Rimington, you can see there, just glancing at this. Whereas others, like Tucker, who is in pink towards the end there, and Whittingham in yellow, you can see are doing a lot more work. I just think this would be the sort of thing that our managers these days would love to have. This is about productivity, is it not, really? But it gives us some insight, some intelligence, really, about the activities of the surveyor's work itself. Henry James, who later became Director General for the Ordnance Survey, was in Ireland. We can map out where Henry James was and the dates at which he worked. And you can see there's a kind of logic to this. There's a pattern which comes out. So these are 3 surveyors. These are all named on the maps. This is just using the map information. We have Tucker, Waters and Stoddard. And you can see how they are allocated to different parts of Ireland for a start. So we've got Waters in the middle, Stoddard on the left and Tucker on the right. So Tucker is working his way down the east coast, isn't he? And you can see again, this is not random. The colours indicate there is a logic to the pattern by which the surveyors are progressing as they go from north to south. So it gives us a window, some insight into the activities of the surveyors for the maps. Of course, the Ordnance Survey were not producing just sort of visual things, the maps themselves. They were also involved very much with other kinds of survey work, including surveying for names, the names that appear on the maps. So we can begin to do some quite interesting analytical work with that information as well. This is for County Donegal, and it's simply looking at the number of a variance of Irish names per townlands in the place name, in the name books, the Ordnance Survey name books, which are being collated at the same time. And you can see again, there's an interesting geography to the distribution. You see the Inishowen Peninsula, for example, there are more variants being recorded than there are in other parts of the county. So these differences, which begin to get, they kind of sort of tease us a bit. Another one is the memoirs. You've got the memoirs down here, the printed volumes. In the memoirs, there were also sketches. So the Ordnance Survey surveyors were not just surveying for the maps, they were also doing field sketching as well, doing drawings in effect, field sketches for the memoirs and for other purposes as well. And again, there's a pattern here which emerges. This is for County Derry. If you look on the right-hand side, which townlands were being sketched by which surveyors. These are the same names we've seen before, actually, many of the names. The surveyors doing the sketching were the same surveyors doing the map work. But there's a big red block there of John Stokes, for example. So Stokes seems to have been almost allocated to this part of County Derry, whereas others like Fagan, for example, is a little bit more random, a bit more of a sort of scatter approach there. And the same for maybe looking at William Butler would be another one there. Butler Williams, getting the right way around. Anyway, the point of this is to say that we can excavate the map. We can excavate the written records of the Ordnance Survey using these digital tools, and they give us some insight, some intelligence around what was going on 200 years ago. These sorts of word maps do the same sort of thing. This is just looking at the memoirs and thinking about the word habit and what other words get associated with habits in the memoirs. And these are the kind of words. The bigger the word here, like social or ancient, the more of a connection between the two. If you want to explore this for yourselves, then the data set is available to you on a platform, on the web, on the internet. It's dri.ie. There's the URL down there, or you could just search. Just do a Google search and it will come up. So 1824, we have the Spring Rice Committee, which is really the start of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. 2024, the bicentenary. And this resource has been created specifically to mark that, the end point of that bicentenary. So the two things I've been talking about there, mapping monuments and OS 200, are both ways in which we begin to address the importance of looking at the field. And I think this is really important for what you're doing here, what Karen is doing here, what Collie's doing here, in looking at field sketching and going outdoors into the landscape. So maps, we're all interested in the map as a final product, perhaps. They're very sort of enticing images. But let's also not forget about that dirty, hard work which lay behind the map, the field. Thanks very much.